Hello again. I'm back.
Yep, okay, so the stream is live, so as is our conversation at the moment, just so you know. And there's a 30-second delay, so I think we'll just wait for some people to come on the stream, and then I usually give people a couple of minutes and then we kind of get into it.
Hmm?
But yeah, and I'll see if Bjarke... I'll see... Okay, Bjarke looks like he's in a different server. I might just message him and let him know. And hello everyone who's joined the stream already. We're just in our setup time. But yeah, stick around and hopefully we'll have some interesting conversations today. And your sound is okay, Daniel?
I'm hearing you fine.
Okay.
You hear me all right?
Pretty good, yeah, pretty good. It's there's some little bits of jumpiness. Can you just say a long sentence for me? I'll just see how it is.
Long sentence for you. Let me know if there's any issues with the sound. I don't know what I can do to improve it. But is this clear enough?
It's pretty good. It's pretty good, yeah. I think what I might do is for any streams that aren't super clear, is I might try to replace them with pre-records when I upload the final stuff. But yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to get onto the YouTube stream and check everything's working okay. Yep, it looks okay to me. We've got about 10 people watching already, which is great. Okay, and it looks like we've got, is that Bjarke? I think, yes it is, okay. Bjarke will probably be silent for you and I, Daniel. Okay, great. Well, let's just give it a couple more minutes. There are some people still joining the stream. Hello, Fred from the Netherlands. Great to see you. Hi, Joe. I assume that's local Joe. And hello, Four Claws. Nice dab.
You just ignored Orson 17. What is this?
Yeah, thanks, Awesome 17. Well, yeah, I guess I hadn't made a Fortnite server on Garry's mod yet, you know. So yeah, shame on me for my laziness. But okay, so now we've hit 4 o'clock, so I think it's a good enough time to get started. So what I'm going to do is I'll just give a brief introduction to the Mod Theory seminar series for those who are joining us for the first time. And in this seminar, I'm the first presenter today, so I will hand over my avatar to someone else to look after it for me, and I'll get into my talk. But for those of you who've just joined us, Mod Theory is an online conference for game studies convened within the computer game Garry's Mod. So that's where we are today. This comes out of some ideas that I've been working on for the last, I guess, year or couple of years. And I'd always kind of been fascinated with, you know, how could communicating in the game environment be useful or, I don't know, not useful or annoying, or basically how does it work to have a game studies conference in a game? And, you know, the obvious geopolitical situation of this year seemed to make this a reasonably ideal time to try out. So today we have 3 speakers. We have Daniel Vella from the University of Malta, Bjarke Liboriussen from University of Nottingham Ningbo, and myself, Peter Nelson, from the Academy of Visual Arts at Hong Kong Baptist University. So welcome Bjarke and Daniel, and we will maybe have some of our other speakers. Oh, Emma Fraser looks like she's on the server as well, perhaps, I'm not sure. We might have some other of the mod theory participants drop into the Garry's mod server. And everybody is, of course, welcome to leave us some questions on the YouTube comments, and we will try to get to them for our discussion at the end. So I'm going to take my seat now. So sorry for any noise of me swapping seats with Folklores. And I'm going to give a talk about landscapes and playgrounds, which also hopefully should be an introduction as to I guess why I wanted to convene a conference like this. Okay, so Folklores is in charge. Heaven help us. So I want to start this presentation with an explanation as to why I decided to study computer games from the perspective of art history and landscape. Before focusing on computer graphics, I'd worked mostly as a practicing artist and I guess a casual art historian, focusing on the history of landscape painting. I studied Chinese landscapes, fascinated by how, the organization of trees and rocks on painted scrolls morphed and transformed over time to reflect historical and social developments and dramatic changes that were occurring in philosophy and political thought. It's... Oh, hold on, I've just got to mute. We're getting some double sound here. Just a second, let me mute the stream. How professional of me. Okay, so yes, I've been studying Chinese landscape painting and super interested in how this expressive mode was sort of sucking up and absorbing all of these changes in intellectual thought that were happening at the time. And in England, Australia and the USA, landscape paintings also really recorded the entire process of the agricultural revolution and the emergence of modern markets and the colonization of the New World. It's really easy for us to forget that it wasn't until English aristocrats started privatizing public land and commissioning paintings of their estates that this fashion of having landscape paintings hung above domestic couches and in living rooms actually, became a thing. These paintings found their ways from the mansions of the wealthy into public museums and gift shop postcards, and they created a way of looking at the world that I argue we replicate every time we go and take tourist photographs of an old town or a pleasing view. And then in the 19th century, the romantic landscape artists in places like Canada, Australia, and North America unwittingly made very complex psychological portraits of colonialism, where their desire to paint Protestant images of a new promised land actually resulted in depictions of the indigenous agricultural systems that most colonial powers really needed to pretend didn't exist in order for this colonization process to actually be legal within the European system. So landscape paintings are this kind of, for me, were always this fascinating medium that, it was a way of looking at the world that kind of sucked up everything that was happening around it. And for someone like me who's interested in landscape in the 21st century, the obvious thing for me to look at was computer games. And so for a number of years, I've been exclusively studying computer games. And in the first 2 sessions of the seminar series, we focused on the interaction between game objects, how are things redefined by how we play with them, and game space. What is the nature of the space we play in? And as Nick, Clancy, and Emma said last week, how should we think about these sort of ruined ragpile spaces as landscapes? And when I started looking at this question myself, the main error that I discovered over and over again was the confusing of aesthetic influences with aesthetic meaning. I think that just because an artist who worked for Nintendo was inspired by German romantic paintings of mountains, this doesn't mean that in Zelda Breath of the Wild we have a reproduction of the romantic sublime. So if we mistake artistic influences for the meaning produced by a new work, I don't think we will ever really appreciate what's happening in computer games, an art form that I believe is the most significant landscape medium of our time. But to study computer games as landscapes requires that we go back to questions of how representation functions in games and what type of spaces they create for us to play in. After all, despite the convenience of screenshots and YouTube walkthroughs, games are not things that we look at. They're usually things that we play with. And as such, we can't read them like a painting or a photograph or a film. We have to read them as something that's played with. And apologies for the keyboard sounds. Four Claws and I are playing and talking at the same time. There's nothing we can do about that. Okay, so Garry's mod. I started studying Garry's mod because I wanted to study the game Counterstrike and Counter-Strike Global Offensive as a landscape. And I was studying Counter-Strike because I'd been studying the game Half-Life 2. And what these games have in common is they share a representational system. They all run on the same game engine, essentially. And art historically, for me, this is very similar to saying they're made with the same medium. And I think having three totally different games made with the same medium is a good opportunity to look at, you know, how the differences in gameplay can result in different landscape readings, whilst so much of the representational system that they're running on is the same. So what I'm going to do now is sort of run through the different landscape structures and landscape readings of Half-Life 2 and Counter-Strike to sort of introduce my initial reading of Garry's mod as a playground, and which is also the theme for today's entire session. Anything happening in the YouTube comments? Okay, no sound disasters. Nice, I'll keep going. Okay, sorry, checking two things at once. So, when I studied Half-Life 2, I concluded that the underlying landscape of the first-person single-player first-person shooter is a safari landscape with a single protagonist. Half-Life 2 presents the player with a linear sequence of puzzles and challenges that gradually reward the player with a sense of accomplishment and domination over the environment. As we walk through this post-apocalyptic landscape with evil alien soldiers and monsters and zombie-type creatures, we sequentially get better and better at overcoming these challenges and dominating the environment. The better we get, the more we feel like the hero who can dominate the landscape. And this type of adventure landscape that's centered around... Was that the oven going off? Lovely. This type of adventure landscape that's centered around the growth of the protagonist has its precedent in New World travel literature, where the physical environment becomes an adventure landscape built to test and confirm the heroism of the protagonist. In the single-player first-person shooter, you are the only witness to the landscape, and every object in this world is therefore turning to face you. The landscape is wrapped around you, challenging and rewarding you for every hardship you overcome. And as the protagonist on this single-player safari, I also identified additional readings from art history that can kind of, I think, help to describe what sort of world we see in the single-player first-person shooter Half-Life. For example, art historian Robin Kelsey's definition of Western landscape as a prolonged experience of not belonging, where the landscape reminds the player that they are singular, looking at something rather than being a part of something. In this framework, landscape functions a little bit like the word nature. It requires us to decide that we are separate from it in order that we can appreciate it as a visual spectacle. In Half-Life 2, I also identified the repressed desire for a protagonist landscape of apocalyptic challenge, and I suggested that we find pleasure in this type of fantasy because it contrasts the monotony and anonymity of our daily lives. After playing Half-Life 2, every air conditioning vent in my life became a potential escape hatch from a life spent in front of my computer. and I fantasize about proving my worth by climbing out through the air conditioning unit and killing monsters with a crowbar. Okay, so moving on from the single-player first-person shooter to Counterstrike, I found something that was completely different. And for those of you who don't know, Counterstrike started as a player-made mod of Half-Life 1. And the current version of Counter-Strike Global Offensive runs on the Valve Source engine, which is the same engine that Garry's mod is running on and that Half-Life 2 was running on. So we sort of have the same, software simulation, but a completely different landscape experience. As soon as the first-person shooter became multiplayer, the landscape is no longer wrapped around a single player. It transforms into this mediating device that provides structure to a competitive game, much like the boundary lines on a sports field structure the game that's being played. A multiplayer shooter landscape cannot be a linear sequence of challenges. Instead, it has to be symmetrical in terms of game balance, because a good game must always be fair. And there's a large number of game scholars who over the past 20 years have established this sort of sport-like ludic architecture. In a competitive multiplayer shooter, every game object is first and foremost a mediating obstacle in a competition over line of sight. Objects define who can see who, and therefore who can shoot who. What we have in Counterstrike, to me, is a form of sports geography, where, sorry, I've just lost my spot for a second. I think you touched the keyboard. That's all right. Gosh, where was I? Just a second. I was talking about Counterstrike and sports geography. Okay, so in Counterstrike we have a form of sports geography, where non-game landscapes like farmhouses, office buildings and tourist sites, train stations, castles, they're all meticulously recreated into something that I think is closer to a basketball court or a football field. When read as a sporting landscape, I think it's a lot easier to understand the transgressive thrill that we see in a lot of the modding community in converting non-game landscapes into game landscapes. Places that, maybe we shouldn't play Counter-Strike in these type of environments. It's the thrill of converting yet another place into this sporting field. The geography of sports, in sports geography we can compare this to something like, skateboarding or parkour or even marathon running. All sorts of games and sports that initially relied on the conversion of non-sport landscapes into sport landscapes. And the other thing that a sports landscape reading helps us do is that understanding these spaces as sporting fields, we can all of a sudden locate a lot of the different social and economic functions that are happening in a game like Counter-Strike. In recent years it's become very clear that the multi-billion-dollar weapons skins economy that underpins professional Counter-Strike competition is very, very similar to the economy that underpins regular sports. It relies heavily on underregulated gambling, money laundering, etc. So for me, the shift from the single-player protagonist hero safari of Half-Life 2 to the multiplayer competition of Counter-Strike is a shift from a kind of a protagonist safari to something that's really a multiplayer sporting landscape. Okay, so now onto what type of landscape Garry's mod is. And the production history of Garry's mod has a lot in common with Counter-Strike. Counter-Strike started as a mod of Half-Life, and Garry's mod was a Half-Life 2 mod that a young programmer named Garry Newman started sharing on the Something Awful web forum back in the early 2000s. Unlike the single-player first-person shooter safari and the multiplayer sports landscape, Garry's mod is the game without the game. It uses the same game engine as the other two, but there's no obvious game to play anymore. There's no obvious way to win, to lose, or to compete. And what's so interesting here is that Garry's mod reveals a sort of a meta landscape, that if you take the computer game and let the engine keep running after the game is finished, I think something like Garry's mod should be waiting underneath most games. As a landscape, Garry's Mod has no linear direction, there's no goal, there's no competitive symmetry. Instead, it has the modular flexibility of a playground. And I think it proves the point of Espen Aarseth's redefinition of computer games as games played in virtual environments. And here, Garry's Mod is the virtual environment that in so many other games we were playing in without realizing. There are, of course, games that we can play in Garry's Mod, but like a playground, the playground will be there even if we're not playing anything. And as a landscape, Garry's Mod is a playground space, filled with equipment that's waiting to be used. In Homo Ludens, Johann Huizinga refers to spaces such as the arena, the tennis court, and even the court of law as types of playgrounds. They are temporary worlds within the ordinary world, dedicated to the performance of an actor part. Within the playground, Huizinga argues, play creates a new sense of order. Into an imperfect world and into the confusion of life, play brings a temporary limited perfection. The player in the playground takes a chance. They make an attempt to resolve the underlying tension that the play situation creates. In fact, the emergence of architecturally designed playgrounds in the mid-20th century derived from a very specific set of geopolitical circumstances. Sociologist and scientist Mergen Odnamsen describes how the Dutch architect Aldo van Eyck began designing children's playgrounds in Amsterdam in the 1950s as a reaction against the rationalizing homogenization of post-war European urban planning. For Van Eyck, playgrounds were a subversive strategy to promote social interaction and ludic creativity outside the instrumental rationality of the market and the monotonous life structure that it promoted. Van Eyck's playgrounds employed a modular lexicon of play equipment, and Van Eyck really valued simple abstract forms like concrete shapes or the plain metal climbing frame, arranged within a non-hierarchical syntax that sought to maximize the expressive potential that children could find in each space, allowing children to appropriate the playground into their own imagination. So a climbing frame might become a house if you throw a blanket over it, or the climbing frame might become a lookout post if you climb all the way to the top. So, contrary to the protagonist safari or the sporting landscape, the playground landscape doesn't offer this resistance of predefined challenges or a pre-agreed upon game that everyone's playing. In Garry's Mod, we face the confrontation of Van Eyck's playground, where the source of fun and resistance is just our own creativity. After 5 minutes of shooting other players with rocket launchers and respawning, I find that I get bored really quickly. I could download a luxury car mod package from the Garry's Mod asset library and drive a Lamborghini around the map, but I usually get bored with this too. It's almost like I'm a billionaire in a billionaire simulator, and the only problem is I can't work out how to enjoy my wealth. In Garry's Mod, I've loaded up levels from Half-Life 2 and spawned in dragons from Skyrim just to watch one game play against another. The playground landscape relies on this modular abstraction where physical components are divorced from the instrumental rationality that are left for the player to then reconfigure and explore. As a playground landscape, Garry's Mod reflects on all the other games that are made using the same engine, and maybe all computer games in general. Underneath the game is just a simulation of objects and spaces, which brings us all the way back to the questions of Seminar 1 and Seminar 2. How are game objects and game spaces defined? By how people play with them. Unlike the abstract steel and concrete playgrounds of Van Eyck, the play equipment of Garry's Mod is the leftover stuff from all the other computer games. And if you go online and search through the asset libraries of Garry's Mod forums, you're going to find game objects and spaces uploaded from every corner of the internet. So, unlike these kind of abstract concrete and steel, Garry's Mod is a remix playground of popular culture fragments, combined into a new, temporary sort of ludic Frankenstein. And this is basically my initial landscape reading of Garry's Mod, a playground landscape. When we want to start describing computer games as landscapes, I think we first need to understand what type of landscape experience is created by how the game can be played. In the same way, I think it's possible to describe a lot of single-player first-person shooters as some form of the protagonist safari, where the landscape wraps around the single player, giving them sequential challenges and confirming their status as the protagonist in the world. I also believe that the absence of this experience in most of our lives is part of the appeal of these games. Similarly, I think it's possible to look at a really large number of multiplayer first-person shooters as some form of sports geography, where, like parkour or skateboarding or marathon running, the landscape is redefined into a competition device that gives great significance to the slightest variation in every object. The height of a park bench in Counterstrike and the height of a park bench for a skateboarder is crucial because of how they've redefined what that park bench is supposed to do. Either it's something that the skateboarder might grind along, or for the Counter-Strike player, it might be the thing that hides them from the view of the other team. And in Garry's mod, we start to study the play equipment itself. In most games, it's simply not possible to be in the game without playing the game. But once this possibility is granted by the sandbox, we face a similar abstraction to that of Aldo van Eyck's Playgrounds, where objects, despite their visual diversity, are always inevitably redefined by how they are played with. And in my talk on Thursday, on the final panel, I'm going to expand on the diversity of game objects in Garry's mod and explore how the Garry's mod sandbox also functions as an aggregator of Web 2.0 cultural content, and can also become an interesting case study for the simulations that are starting to redefine cultural production and consumption in the age of user-generated content. That's it for my talk. Thank you very much. And thank you for keeping me alive or dead. Folklores. Emma Fraser, aren't all games a remix of fragments? I guess this is the implication. Sorry, I'm reading questions from the YouTube. I guess this is the implication. I guess like my question to you the other day, are all games ruins? Do we, I guess, do our definitions in being too general risk a sort of specific fine-grained analysis? I have to think about this. Oh, I'm getting shot. Okay, so maybe that's a good reminder to switch to our next speaker, which is going to be Bjarke Liboriussen. And Bjarke is on the server. Maybe that was Bjarke who shot me. But Bjarke, for connection reasons, we decided to pre-record Bjarke's presentation just so that the audio is in better quality. So I'll just flip over to my MP3 player, and we will hear from Bjarke Liboriussen. Looks like we've lost our speakers podium. Maybe I'll put a new speakers podium in, just for fun. But Bjarke, as you're pre-recorded, you're also welcome to just keep playing. But you know, there's our tokenistic. Oh God, I killed it. There's our tokenistic speakers podium. Okay, so Bjarke Liboriussen. I'll get that playing as soon as I can find where I minimized it to. Okay, that still seems to be loading. Just a second. Okay, I might just have to reopen that. Sorry for the disruption. Just a sec.
Thank you, Peter, for the invitation to this virtual seminar to talk about landscapes and playgrounds inside Garry's mod. I'm Bjarke Liboriussen. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China. First, I'll say a little bit about the theoretical frameworks available to reflect on landscapes and playgrounds inside Garry's mod, and by extension, in video games and virtual worlds more generally. Then I'll revisit previous work on the landscape aesthetics of video games. By previous work, I'm primarily referring to my PhD thesis, which I completed in 2009, just in time for the waning of intense interest in Second Life. I mention Second Life because I think there might be some resemblance between the anarchic spirit of parts of Second Life at the time and what we see with Garry's mod today. Finally, I'll say just a little bit about playgrounds. I really like the title I've been given more and more the more I think about it. Landscapes and playgrounds. I believe they are conceptual opposites. I'll try to drive home that point by mentioning the erotics of playgrounds at the very end of my presentation. Theory. There is a mini tradition of spatial critique of capitalism at the crossroads of philosophy and anthropology, primarily French philosophy and anthropology. The tradition begins with the Marxist Guy Debord, the godfather of the Situationist movement. His main work was a 1967 book called The Society of the Spectacle. It's a bitter and revolutionary critique of consumer society characterized by abstraction, in the sense that commodification is essentially abstraction and runs parallel with a prioritizing of sight as a relatively more abstract sense. In the 1970s, Henri Lefebvre continues this mini tradition with the production of space. I'll skip ahead to Marc Auger and his 1992 book, Non-Places. Non-places don't have centers, but your identity is checked when you enter them, as ours were when we entered this non-place. I'd like to suggest that we can place Dutch architect Rem Koolhaas in this tradition. In 2001, Koolhaas contributed with the concept of junk space, which I find fitting to describe several virtual worlds, including this one. Debord, Auger, and Koolhaas share a sense that in consumerist societies, something important happens to our conceptualizations of space. The three authors focus on built infrastructures intended for transportation, consumption, and entertainment. Where Auger describes non-place as the essential product of supermodernity, Koolhaas describes junk space as modernity's waste. Junk space is, quote, additive, layered, and lightweight, end quote. What junk space offers, instead of dwelling places, is a space where, quote, all materialization is provisional. Cutting, bending, tearing, coding. Construction has acquired a new softness. Junk space is a kingdom of morphing. Restore, rearrange, reassemble, revamp, renovate, revise, recover, redesign. Verbs that start with re produce junk space. End quote. What are landscapes and playgrounds of virtual junk spaces? In junk space, any size is possible. Quote, there's no form, only proliferation, end quote. In other words, the difference between inside and outside is unimportant. Avoiding a sharp delineation of inside and outside has been an important theme for architectural discourse in the 20th century. Before returning to the landscapes of virtual
Okay, sorry everyone. That Bjarke's thing has just stopped on my computer for some reason. I'll see if I can restart it.
Thank you, Peter,
No,
for
that's not where we were.
the invitation
That's frustrating. Just let me find the right spot.
to this. Venturi uses the urban realization.
Still hearing it on the live stream.
Sorry, can you say that again?
No, never mind. I was still hearing it on the live stream, but it stopped now.
Oh yes, no, there's a 30-second delay on the live stream. Just let me find where we were up to. Just a sec.
Has lost its prominent example of the latter being the Indian city of Chandigarh. In Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, there's a similar,
That's about right.
before returning to the landscapes of morphing and entertainment. Materialization entered this built infrastructures intended for
I'm going to put it at 4 minutes. I
transportation,
think that was about right,
consumption,
but I'm sorry for
and entertainment.
any of the
Coding.
repetition.
Construction has acquired a new softness. Junk space is a kingdom of morphing. Restore, rearrange, reassemble, revamp, renovate, revise, recover, redesign. Verbs that start with re produce junk space. End quote. What are landscapes and playgrounds of virtual junk spaces? In junk space, any size is possible. Quote, there's no form, only proliferation, end quote. In other words, the difference between inside and outside is unimportant. Avoiding a sharp delineation of inside and outside has been an important theme for architectural discourse in this 20th century. Before returning to the landscapes of virtual junk spaces, I'd like a brief detour into architectural discourse. During the 20th century, architects began to regard not only the individual building but the entire city or region as their subject matter. Le Corbusier's ambition in this regard is very outspoken. In his texts, the thoughts on individual buildings and city planning intermingle seamlessly. As for realized projects, Le Corbusier tried his hands on both buildings and cities, with the most prominent example of the latter being the Indian city of Chandigarh. In Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, there's a similar tendency to slide quickly from examples of individual buildings to cities and back again. And this goes to build up a central challenge that, quote, architecture opens the door once again to an urbanistic point of view, end quote. Venturi comes to this battle cry for an urbanistic point of view through the realization that architecture has lost its way by forgetting the basic distinction between outside and inside. Venturi calls for, quote, a break away from the contemporary concept, and this is the 1960s, a break away from the contemporary concept, call it sickness, of spatial continuity and a tendency to erase every articulation between spaces, that is, between outside and inside, between one space and another, between one reality and another, end quote. When Venturi is attacking spatial continuity, it should not be read as defense of the interior against the outside, but as a defense of the in-between. Venturi uses the urban as a frame for his thoughts on the inside, the outside, and the in-between. But another frame presents itself: landscape. An example: Jørn Utzon's iconic Sydney Opera House, which Utzon thought of as a continuous landscape, as a continuum between inside and outside. The Opera House is made up of several individual buildings placed on a platform. The buildings house various venues, and as the public moves to, from, and in between these venues, they are disregarding the difference between inside and outside. Additionally, the platform has an attractive waterside location, which generates a flow of pedestrian movement, exemplifying what Venturi calls exterior forces of use. The concept of landscape is, however, not only found in writings on certified masterpieces. Venturi hinted at the landscape in complexity and contradiction in architecture, as he found fuel for his urbanistic point of view in, quote, the everyday landscape, vulgar and disdained, end quote. Venturi was alluding to the landscape of the typical American main street. In Learning from Las Vegas, his next book, he was to boost his attack on the architectural establishment by turning his attention from Main Street to some.
Okay, looks like this MP3 player is seriously buggy. So we're up to 9 minutes and 7. I'm sorry about this. I'm just going to have to open that quickly again. 9 minutes and 7.
Thank you, Peter, for the invitation to this very vulgar and disdained, namely the Strip of Las Vegas. Main Street and the Strip are, quote, our real landscape, end quote, because they are built for how people actually live, that is, in Venturi's American context, as consumers who travel by car. In the landscape of highways, gas stations, ramps, and strip malls, the distinction between nature and built becomes blurred. Or, as Anthony Vidler has it when he is writing about the new condition of architecture in general, quote, landscape emerges as a mode of envisaging the continuum of the built and the natural, the building and the city, the site and the territory. End quote. In the virtual world, a sense of inside and outside, and of trees being natural and buildings being built, probably still lingers in us, even though true distinctions between inside and outside, built and natural, are impossible. The concept of landscape nicely captures this sense of soft difference, continuum, in between. Having noted the need to think virtual landscape in between, I've fleshed out some of the analytical categories that we can find in between or on various continuums. This fleshing out of analytical categories was an exercise in importing landscape aesthetics into game studies. Landscape aesthetics can roughly be divided into naturalist and culturalist attitudes to landscape. The naturalist attitude can be summed up as the view that landscape is another word for environment. Here we find work by psychologists such as Rachel and Stephen Kaplan and the philosopher Dennis Dutton. Dutton died in 2010, but in his last book, The Art Instinct from 2009, he essentially argued that experiencing a real landscape or a landscape painting, or by extension a virtual world landscape, is the same thing. In the grand perspective of evolution, we as a race have spent 80,000 generations on the savannah and merely 380 generations beyond the savannah. Various representational techniques have had practically no time to influence our response to landscapes. So the real savannah landscape has left a powerful mark. In the naturalistic perspective, the landscape is environment. The image is a minor detail which have only risen to prominence very recently as a thin surface layer pointing to environmental reality. In the culturalist view, on the other hand, representation is much more important. Phenomenologist philosopher Edward S. Casey writes, quote, the truth is that representation is not a contingent manner, something merely secondary. It is integral to the perception of landscape itself, indeed part of its being and essential to its manifestation. For analytical purposes, it is convenient to hold on to the distinction between landscape as environment and landscape as image as endpoles of a continuum, although the two are integrated in the actual experience of landscape. In many game worlds, it would make sense to talk of landscape as environment, when the game world is experienced as a pure environment of survival. However, we might also want to talk of landscape as image. For example, when users are producing and sharing landscape as image, that is, screenshots. Here we can talk of landscape connoisseurship. We shouldn't forget that only a few of those who enter virtual junk spaces can be thought of or would think of themselves as builders, architects, or designers. Most users are players or consumers, including me, by the way. These players produce and share significant amounts of landscape images as screenshots. Elsewhere, I've discussed these experiential modes in some detail. This way of thinking about virtual landscape as environment versus landscape as image, lends itself well to being summarized as tables. But what of the playgrounds of my title, Landscapes and Playgrounds? Would playgrounds fit into my tables? The landscapes of playgrounds or playground as landscape? In short, no. When you conceptually come to landscape through architectural discourse, looking for soft distinctions between inside and outside, built and natural, and then import naturalist and culturalist landscape aesthetics into game studies, there isn't much room for play. In other words, conceptual clarity would be significantly weakened. I doubt there would be much analytical efficacy to show from such a move. There's more to be gained from letting landscapes stand in contrast to playgrounds. Going back to the concept of junk space then, for inspiration. Movement in junk space, quote, is a special way of moving, at the same time aimless and purposeful, end quote. This sounds promising, as something you could observe, maybe even experience, at a playground, aimless and purposeful. Junk space is, quote, a space of collision, a container of atoms busy, not dense, end quote. From a commercial viewpoint, junk space must be buzzing with movement, people on their way, shopping, looking.
Another sound pause. Sorry about this. I didn't test this MP3 player. I assumed it would work. Okay, just a moment. We're at 16:07, and hopefully we can get this in one more go. 16:07.
Thank you, Peter, for the invitation to this virtual seminar. This movement has to follow unique trajectories rather than collective. Movement has to follow unique trajectories rather than collective flows, otherwise disaster might occur. Kohlhaas. Junk space is often described as a space of flows, but this is a misnomer. Flows depend on disciplined movement, bodies that cohere. Junk space is a web without spider. Although it is an architecture of the masses, each trajectory is strictly unique. End quote. Whether they are games or not, virtual worlds are often described as sandboxes, a classic of physical playgrounds, or webs without spiders, as Kohlhaas had it in the quote about junk space. That is, spaces of activities with no fixed end goals. That's as far as I've gotten so far when thinking about virtual playgrounds of junk space. But before I end, I have to mention a book that I'm very excited about. It was published only last month by New York University Press. It's Christopher Patterson's Open World Empire, Race, Erotics, and the Global Rise of Video Games. It helps me reconsider game studies, as it challenges several of the foundational texts that I hold dear. What is relevant here is the notion of erotics. Try to think of the erotics of playgrounds. That might sound problematic, and that's the whole point. Quote, erotics is an art of conceiving how pleasure, desire, and the interactive work upon the body as a way to master ourselves and to recognize how our pleasures impact others. In games, these desires are often social and political. The desire for power, for self-optimization, for knowledge, the desire to dominate, and the pleasures of being dominated. End quote. Elsewhere in the introduction, Patterson writes, in being construed as non-sexual, and I think that's a fair description of my approach to landscape aesthetics of video games. In being construed as non-sexual, games discourses have divided play from fetish, immersion from love, interaction from intimacy, and pleasure from sex. End quote. To get full analytical mileage out of the concept of junk space, we should consider both the landscapes and the playgrounds of virtual junk spaces. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Bjarke. I know you're here. I know you can hear us. I deeply apologise for the jitteriness of my MP3 playing software. It teaches me not to download something a little bit better and test it first. I didn't see that one coming. But that was a wonderful presentation, and I mean, I wish we had a bit more of a stable connection, because it seems like we have some kind of opposing frameworks here for discussions of landscape, and in a way also with Nick's presentation on landscape as sight last week. This, I guess, intersection between, as you said, a kind of geography and culture studies approach to landscape compared to architectural theory does present some things that are perhaps in a starker conflict than sometimes I realise. So I wonder if somehow maybe a few well-chosen comments in the YouTube thread could explore this a little bit further in our questions. What I might do is I might just do a little bit of a server cleanup. I'm just always conscious of crashing the server and destroying the experience. So I'm going to do a server cleanup, and then I'll make a place for our final speaker, Daniel Vella, to sit, and then I'll mute my microphone and welcome Daniel to the stage. So just let me do cleanup, okay, and let me add in a stage. There's the mod theory stage. Okay, that'll do. Near enough. And I will welcome to the stage Daniel Vella from the University of Malta. Take it away, Daniel.
Hi, Peter. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the stage. So, yeah, I'm Daniel Vella. I'm at the Institute of Digital Games at the University of Malta. And I've written in the past about the placeness of video game worlds. I'm mostly drawing upon a kind of phenomenological tradition of looking at space and place in relation to the idea of human being in place. This previous work I drew on thinkers like E. Futuan, Christian Norberg-Schutz, and Edward S. Casey, who I already spoke about, as the foundation for this kind of approach to place in games. In this tradition of looking at the idea of place, placeness is considered as an experience. And it's an experience that's structured as something of an encounter. Oh, the stage is floating, nice. Encounter between a given landscape and the individual as a being in a particular body, with particular goals and so on. As Casey writes, place is what happens between the body and landscape. In some of my previous work, I looked at games like Minecraft and Proteus, comparing the ways in which those two very different games both present a vision of the landscape as wilderness, then structure very different modes of being in the landscape for their players. I talked about Minecraft in relation to Heidegger's concept of standing reserve, in that the game invites players to translate its landscapes into units of resource, into wood, stone, iron, and so on, and to stockpile towards building projects. I also talked about Proteus in terms of how the player's inability to engage with the landscape presents the romantic subject's alienated experience of place, defined by exile and movement. Some other work, so in a book chapter which was published last year in the collection Ludotopia, by Espen Arst and Stefan Gunsel, talked about Minecraft again, also about Animal Crossing, examples of games that allow their worlds to be experienced as places of dwelling. Here I drew on Heidegger's essay, Building Dwelling Thinking, also on Christian Norberg Schulz's Phenomenology of Built Space, describe how these games structure the experience of places of dwelling. I talk about things like practices of pausing and lingering, that arrest the usual pattern of forward motion and progress by which we usually engage with game spaces. I talk about the putting down of a center marked by the home, from which we measure the distance of the outward journey. And I talk about the demarcation of an inside and outside. I think also Gaston Bachelard's claim in The Poetics of Space that the demarcation is the fundamental gesture of architecture. Also the familiarity of habit, right? Emerging over repetitions of the practices in which a place is mapped out for us. It's like, in Animal Crossing, the player will tend to settle into a kind of routine of daily and weekly tasks, which take her along habitual paths around her hometown. These points address not only the spatiality, but also the temporality of placeness. That's the way in which placeness is built through certain patterns in both space and time. It emerges through the building practices that respond to a given landscape, and also through the repetition of habitual practices that make it the place that it is for us. Over the past couple of months, like everyone else in the world, I've been playing a lot of Animal Crossing New Horizons. Almost 150 hours, my Switch tells me. That's kind of slightly scary. So I found myself thinking about this chapter again, about something that sets New Horizons apart from earlier Animal Crossing games. I refer here to a review of New Horizons that Stephen Skyfe wrote for Slant magazine. It begins by laying out the kind of long-standing appeal of the series that New Horizons shares and extends. He writes that through minutes that pass by in real time and activities that change based on month or time of day, games cultivate a sort of relationship between players and the virtual space they eventually inhabit. Come to know its layouts and its occupants, moving around the place and helping to maintain it. Here, Skyfe homes in on the sense of dwelling, which I foregrounded in my chapter, the repetition, habit, and the routine which structure the practices of dwelling, and the constant work of building which goes into its maintenance. Then he says that though all of this is still very much present in New Horizons, things change later on. And this is largely because of how much leeway the game gives you to shape and reshape your island at will. He writes, quote, eventually, you get game-changing terrain tools to freely remap the cliffs and the water. At that point, the only thing holding your island together is any attachment you fostered with the way things have looked for the many prior hours of play. Maybe we choose to keep things the way they are, get the power to reshape and remake however we please. Enough of New Horizons is still measured and thoughtful enough to foster these connections that make the series so refreshing and vital. It also feels tainted, this world so much more blatantly at your mercy. Rather than a newcomer to a simulated community that was there before you, you're now the god of the sandbox. End quote. In giving the player near absolute power to reshape their island at will, spatial qualities which structure its placeness are stripped of their staying power. When landscape becomes a verb, landscape as a noun loses all of its power, and disappears from view. It is no longer the given landscape into which I am thrown, if I have absolute power to remake it. Why fit yourself to the patterns and suggestions of the given landscape when you can change the course of rivers or erase them, flatten cliffs or raise them up as you see fit? And just as the spatial structures of play are rendered arbitrary and thrown into disarray, so are its temporal structures. I refer here to the book Scent of Time by the philosopher Byung-Chul Han. There he describes what he calls a contemporary crisis of temporality. He writes that human being in the world is founded on, quote, experience that is based on temporal extension, interconnections between temporal horizons. The present connects to the past through memory, to the future through projects, or the anticipation of change. Where everything can be made and remade at will, temporal extension breaks down. Our past choices do not form a commitment to be honored in the present. The consequences, we can simply delete them. Disappear which were not anticipated in the past. It's really out of nowhere because there was nothing in the place world that gave rise to them, to change of course either causality or intention. And in the same way, our present actions lose their connections to the future. When this happens, we find ourselves in what Hahn calls atomized time, in quote, life as a directionless sequence of present moments, a galaxy of point-like presences between which there is no longer any temporal attraction. Hahn, this atomization of time is inseparable from a breakdown of space. Just as spatial distances are erased by instantaneous communication and intercontinental travel, so is the passage of time erased. We are never on the way to something, never wait, but in between places disappear. Instead, everything is present at the same time. Everything can be instantaneously accessed. I'm kind of reminded here of the Arcade Fire song, We Used to Wait. We no longer have to wait until a certain time of day for our favorite TV show. A TV show we can possibly want to watch is instantly available to us, anytime we want to watch it. In this context, Hahn says, born from their anchorings in spatial and temporal extension, things lose their thingness and become information. Quote, be stored and arbitrarily retrieved. Things are deprived of memory, they become information or commodities. They are pushed into a time-free ahistorical space. Quote, everything everywhere all of the time, everything always available. As a result, it says, quote, nothing is incisive, nothing final. Due to the excessive number of possible connections, i.e. possible directions, are rarely ever completed. Quote, this immediate availability of everything removes the directionality of the path, or the temporal part of a goal or of waiting. He says, quote, space made up of possibilities for further connection does not have any continuity. In it, again and again, decisions are made anew, and new possibilities are pursued, making time discontinuous. No decision is final. The suspended is linear, irreversible time. Everything makes up the present at the same time. Everything has the opportunity, even must have the opportunity of becoming part of the present. Everything pushes into the present. The consequence is a pushing and shoving of images, events, and informations, which makes any lingering contemplation impossible. Thus, one zaps through the world. And, looking around me at what's happening on the server, I don't think that that's far off what we're seeing. I think there's a link to be drawn here also to the work of the philosopher Federico Campagna and his presentation of the reality system which holds sway over the contemporary sphere, which he calls technic. In this way of organizing the world, the organizing principle which holds sway is what he describes as measure. By this we can understand not only the logic of quantification and the measurability of everything, but also something like ontology in the sense that it's given in computer science. It is ontology as categorization of all objects into distinct and clearly defined categories. As he writes, quote, the notion of measure consists in the original act of cutting up the world in a manner that makes it available to be infinitely recombined. Measure not only cuts up the world into categories in this way, also organizes these categories into a grammar of positions, into functions in the system. As a result, an object's category, or the position it fills within the system, becomes more important than the existence of the individual being, of the individual thing. He says, with measure as a basic ontological principle, we, quote, move from an ontology of unique and irreducible things to an ontology of positions in a series. this process, things are reduced to equivalent units, which are present in the world only in as much as we are able to activate such grammatical positions. All these watermelons, which is this Peter? Yes, is spawning in front of me on the server. They're identical in the individual watermelon, doesn't matter. What matters is the category watermelon. So I'll use it as a bridge to return now to Animal Crossing New Horizons, and relatedly to Garry's mod, Han and Campania in mind. The instant availability of everything, the capacity to make and unmake at will, resulting atomization of time, importance of the category over the unique thing. All of these describe the world as seen by Han and Campania. And they certainly describe these two virtual sandboxes. In New Horizons, you can carry full-grown trees in your pocket, erase rivers, or bring them into being. Every possibility for your island's landscape can be immediately available. You accidentally smash one of the starting boulders on your island while getting resources out of it, it doesn't matter. Another one will spawn overnight. The position of boulder in the system of your island has been refilled. You don't much care that it's not the same boulder, or you just pretend that it is. Garry's mod goes even further in this regard. All of Half-Life 2's objects and existence can be willed into being whenever you want, as many times as you want, and just as easily deleted. One buggy, one antlion, one tree is as good as another. They're all identical. There's never any span of time between wanting something and getting it. Just press Q, choose from the menu, and spawn it. There's no planning, there's no projecting into the future, no memory of habit when everything can be changed from one moment to the next. For this reason, and perhaps being a bit polemical here, I find it hard to think of Garry's mod as a place. Only an empty container, a blank horizon. The sandbox is a non-place. It's a possibility space which is potentially anything. It is difficult to imagine any of those potentials coalescing and lingering long enough to accrue baseness. What can one build in a sandbox? Nothing except a sandcastle. The sandcastle, of course, is the cultural metaphor for impermanence. A constellation of objects into being might form a temporary arrangement, suggest certain action possibilities, just like Peter spawned a chair at the start of the session. Stage, which suggests the possibility of speaking to an audience. Oh no, I've been killed. Doesn't matter, I just respawn. But that might lead us to speak of very temporary space bubbles, hold their shape long enough to register as places, emerging out of the primordial ooze of the sandbox. New stage, there we go. Respawn, doesn't matter. Even these place bubbles are unlikely to last long. After all, the actions the sandbox affords are making and unmaking. Maybe this is a spectrum. Virtual worlds in general are already more malleable and less enduring than the actual world. Garry's mod only pushes the malleability of virtual worlds to its logical extension, giving us a world in which nothing is of consequence. Compare this again to Animal Crossing, temporality that even New Horizons still gives us. You plant an orange tree today, the expectation of picking fruit in 3 days' time. With all plans, this requires commitment. It requires a span of time as a path between the seed of the plan and its fruition. It would be possible to imagine a version of Animal Crossing in which this temporality is extended even further, in which trees age every month. They are not cut down, growing gnarly and venerable, in which rocks that are not broken up gather moss over the years, rather than you being able to craft ready-made mossy rock to decorate your garden with. At that point, why not go out and tend to an actual garden instead? Maybe to emphasize the stability of placeness, to turn away from the specificity of the digital and digitally mediated virtual spaces, which lies precisely in such instability. This is what makes them digital, this is what makes them virtual. In the book, which I've just published with my colleague Stefano Guareni, we talk about a fluidifying sway, refer to the fact that in a virtual environment, nothing, not the environment and not our being within it, needs to take a fixed shape. Everything can change from one minute to the next. Choices can be made, unmade, and remade. Cause need not necessarily be linked with effect. Everything is fluid and everything is changeable. Maybe this is the way to bridge to the term from the title of today's session, which I haven't really talked about much, that is playground. So some theorists and philosophers of play, Gadamer, for example, write about play as a to and fro movement, a wavering between possibilities and arrangements. Maybe what we have in the sandbox is a free play of placeness, right? This wavering and quick shift and movement between different place bubbles, between different possibilities of placeness. But again, this is very different from what we usually understand as a playground. Playgrounds tend to be quite fixed, right? They tend to have a range of structures, constructions, paths, and spaces. Games we play in the playground might change. We might think of new patterns of behavior. We might give new significations to the structures in the playground. These are all the result of our bodily engagement with the affordances of those structures and constructions. In his presentation today, Peter talked about the climbing frame and the way we can put a blanket over it to change it, but the properties of the climbing frame don't change. It is a fixed structure. Even the playful reactions to place inherent in situationist practices of flaneurism or the derive or so on are relations to a fixed topography, playscape. If you think back to the favorite playground of your childhood, this placeness is beyond question. You can map it out. You can describe the practices that made it a place for you, the specific fixed properties of that place which gave rise to those practices. The shiny metal slide that was too hot to touch in the summer's sun, the way it forced you to slide with your knees and arms up, or the cement planters behind which you could hide in a game of hide and seek, and so on. Another theorist of play, right, Eugen Fink, wrote that play is always about this encounter with resisting beings, the material toys or playthings that structure play practices as responses to their material affordances and limitations. I believe this is similar, as I understand it, to what in the digital domain Olilino refers to as the gameplay condition, right? This the way the digital materiality kind of upholds responsibility for your choices and what you do in the game. Playground, as with all places, is a resisting place. There is no material resistances where we can will existence into and out of existence as we wish. There is no gameplay condition. I was struck by Peter's point regarding the billionaire in the billionaire's playground. Boredom ensures where there is no resistance. I was reminded somehow of a chapter in Julian Barnes's novel, A History of the World in 10.5 chapters, which presents the experience of heaven, right? And this kind of ideal afterlife where anything you want is immediately available to you. How the inevitable result of that is boredom. If there's no placeness in the sandbox, if there's no resistance, and none of this structures which give rise to placeness, and therefore no place, what is there instead? And I will end with that open question, hopefully to invite further discussion. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was wonderful. As the landscape is crashing down around me, or the playground.
I can see that.
And thanks for managing to juggle your presentation with the death and resurrection of your avatar. This my principal struggle in these seminars is trying to read the YouTube comments, trying to make sure I got the correct microphone muted, and trying to be the cameraman at the same time. So it's quite an achievement to change stages and observe in what's happening on the server as you present. So thanks for the multitasking effort.
That was an interesting challenge.
Yeah, I mean, because in a way, it's sort of what the hypothesis of this whole kind of endeavor was, to see how a kind of a medium specific game environment. It's a not a very good formulation, but you know what I mean. How that alters the type of conversations that we have, or how even talking on the topics that I think we've already been working on for a while, how that is changed by being in an environment sort of built out of the topic that we're talking about. I'm just going to have a quick look through the YouTube comments to remind myself of where the conversation's at. There were some interesting, I guess, conflicts or inconsistencies, and we're all sort of talking about landscape, I think, in a slightly different way. And I was wondering, it might be a good idea to highlight some of these inconsistencies, and perhaps maybe Bjarke, if you're there, I'll read out anything you say on the YouTube chat. But first, I sort of wanted to ask you, Daniel, this distinction. Now I have to get my brain working again. The distinction that Bjarke was making between, I guess, an architectural theory of a playground and an architectural theory of a landscape and landscape design and vistas and so forth, compared to a landscape as something that's experienced. And here I think Emma also mentioned Edward Casey's distinction between space and place, place being sort of that thing that emerges from experience. How do you feel about these, what Bjarke pointed out as slightly contradictory ways of thinking about landscape? I'm thinking in particular of, I think you mentioned when landscape is a verb or a noun.
That's something I was referring to, the act of landscaping and the way in which Animal Crossing New Horizons presents these landscaping tools and invites you to remake the island, do whatever you want it within the possibilities of the system. And landscaping is what's been happening on the Garry's mod server right now. I'm just seeing these big, rock formations which have spawned. In regards to the kind of landscape playground distinction, I think in some of these theories of space and place, so like in the way in which Casey uses the term landscape, for example, in some of his books, landscape is a kind of horizon in a sense. It's a place is closer to us than landscape, right? Landscape is, as in the idea of landscape painting or landscape photography, it's a vista. It's something which is somehow further away from us than our lived immediate environment. Something from which there's a sense of detachment. Playground is a place, right, with which we engage in certain kind of conventional practices. We approach a playground having some idea of what kind of behaviors are and are not expected there, of what kind of practices it should afford. Of course, we can come up with new practices and come up with new possibilities for that place. That's going to happen against the background of this understanding of what a playground means as a place. That's how I would understand that distinction between landscape and playground.
Okay, yeah, because I think the way that I typically look at landscape, I guess I don't know if it comes from the art historical background or maybe the historical connection between art history and geography, that my reading of landscape is usually sort of coming out of like the W.J.T. Mitchell sense of landscape as a historical text that inevitably even the playground is in some way a recorder of just what has been done and is being done to the physical environment by the person who is capable of observing it as a landscape. So in this way, the national park and the city sidewalk are equally landscapes that record, just a kind of a, I guess it's the human strata on the physical environment that that we can read as a historical text. So for me, the playground as a category, I understand architecturally that we have a whole sort of functional hierarchy of what can be done in landscaping and landscape design, or in designing a play space. For me, I tend to want to zoom out a little bit and just see these as yet another set of categories of things that we do to the physical environment, and as such can be used to reflect on this doing and this sort of history that is being enacted upon the physical environment. And I don't know if I disrespect that kind of category distinction a little bit too flagrantly.
I'm not very familiar with Mitchell's work, but I don't think that what you're saying necessarily contradicts this distinction. It's just a different way of looking at it. If, as you're saying, you're looking at the landscape, there is in text right through which you can read history, social history, and so on, right? And then, of course, you can look at a playground or any other kind of built space the same way as you would look at a natural landscape and read it in the same way. But that act of observing, you did use the word observing, right? You are getting that distance, right? Then you are thinking of it as a vista, as something you are at that point, at that moment, and detached from. When you're reading the playground, necessarily in the active position of playing in the playground. In the same way of in a natural landscape, you observe it from a distance, but then when you're hiking through it, it becomes a hiking path, right? It becomes a place where you're thinking of what's possible and not possible for you to do. Which paths are you fit enough to follow? Which climbs do you have the equipment for? So on. And then you think of it again as a landscape when you get to a viewpoint and you take the distance again. You just think, this is such a nice view. This is a beautiful landscape.
So landscape is sort of like the screenshot moment for you. It's the moment when it becomes image.
It's, distance, or this is, I won't use the word immersion, but engagement perhaps. Active, practical doing within the place. With the 4KC, 4.2, and so on, place emerges through doing rather than through observing from a distance.
Well, because for me, I think I see observing from a distance as again as sort of a subcategory that the history of tourism and the history of landscape images they're not that separable. I know there's some of the early picturesque manuals that are sort of the modern precursors to modern tourism. In the UK, I think it was like the context of the Napoleonic Wars and travel being a little bit shut down. I guess it's something that seems familiar now. But there was a big push for domestic tourism and to, in a way, re-mythologize the new landscape of the picturesque. That after the enclosures and all the huge estates had been built, there was I'm thinking of people like Keith Ears of the Picturesque, William something, whose name popped out of my head, writing travel manuals of how to travel through the English landscape to the correct place where then you can sit down and draw an image. And when you draw the image, these are the sort of things you'll be looking for, perhaps gnarled trees or a certain roughness in the rocks, and basically kind of image composition notes. And for me, when I read these books, the tourism and the image that results are similar. And when I go hiking, I can't help but think of this practice of hunting almost, where you're walking up the mountain, and the prey is the vista, is the view, and so even the walking is kind of contextualized by the image making that. The two don't have a particularly clean separation, so perhaps that's why I tend to skip in and out of image and experience in that way.
Of course, and that's not even that's something which is still very much current, right? I mean, as you were describing that, I was thinking of a few years ago after DIGRA in Utah on a road trip through Utah on a road which is specifically marked as a scenic byway, and along the road there are specifically marked points, places where you're meant to stop while you're driving down this road, and there'll be a plaque with like a with an image of the view marking out the things you should look at from this view. Here you're seeing this particular mountain and then some facts about that mountain and so on. And as you keep driving on this road, you're going to keep encountering all these particular marked viewpoints or overlooks. That's still a mode in which the landscape is consumed.
Yes, I mean, I'll never forget.
Which is very kind.
I remember once when I was young traveling, I met a guy in a youth hostel who was describing to me very proudly how he had done Paris in one day. And I thought, I have no idea what this means, but this guy's in my dormitory, so I can't really ignore him. And he was saying, do you want to know how I did it? And I thought, okay, sure. And he said he reached down next to his bed and he pulled out one of those folding scooters. And he said, I went to the Eiffel Tower, the Arc de Triomphe, the Louvre, and I don't know, whatever else is in Paris in one day. And I had this image in my head of this idiot, speeding through Paris, sweat, dripping down his face, getting to every object, touching it, taking a photo, and then going to the next one. But, in a way it's not that kind of absurd an abstraction for this idea of the consumption of landscape. And when I was going through a couple of years ago a kind of a taxonomy of all of the different maps that are on Counterstrike, it's very hard to ignore the idea of tourism, because the way that Counterstrike so kind of beautifully identifies types of spaces, that those types, I think tourism does the same thing. What type of place do you want to go to? And there are so many tourist landscapes in Counterstrike, like a lot of historical sites, or there's a great map of Venice that really does look like just a bunch of postcards. And I think also in the history of sports geography, you have obviously things like the Tour de France, where it's a complete amalgamation of sports and tourism. That the riders are sort of taking the audience on a trip through the French countryside, and marathon running sort of does the same thing. It appropriates the landscape for very goal-based activity in the exact same way that Counterstrike does, but then ambiently, you get to enjoy Venice at the same time. Like, I love playing Counterstrike in Venice. I wish there was more Venice in it, so I could kind of, have a purpose to my activity. Because otherwise, I don't know anything about Venice. I don't know the history of Italian architecture, or really a great deal about, I don't know, the merchant, the growth of the merchant capitalism in whatever Venice is about. To be honest, I know probably about as much as is in the guidebook. So there's a kind of an inseparable nature of the images we hunt for, but the way that we're able to be in these spaces at all, and tourism is beautiful for sort of highlighting that. And then it separates spaces for us that are not touristic. If something is not worthy of taking a photograph, if it has a sort of banality, then in a way is that defined simply against those things that are image worthy, that are exceptional enough to be incorporated into this image making mode.
Yeah, I mean, what you were describing with this guy in Paris sounds a bit like the idea of a speed run, right? Like there's something to be achieved, and it's about picking boxes, right? Kind of, you've done this, you've done that, you've done other thing, so you have done Paris, according to some understanding of what doing Paris means. Kind of, I mean, of course, it's ridiculous, put that way, but there's also a recognized tendency, in my own living, let's say, of being in a particular city, usually for reasons of a conference or work or something like that, thinking, okay, I have one free afternoon, what can I fit in? And inevitably, it's nowhere near all the things I would like to see or do in the city, but trying to as many boxes as possible within the time you have. And of course, the idea of what you should see or do is sort of a construct. You're going to have all these lists of 1001 places you must see before you die. The 30 restaurants you must eat in Venice. Whatever kind of list. You know what I mean? There's a whole industry of these checkbox lists and guidebooks and so on.
And as much as I make fun of it, it's more to say that I'm a victim of the exact same thing. My imagination is constrained by applying a task-based way of thinking to the world around me. And because whilst I know it's absurd, it's sort of I guess there's all these great books on like landscape phenomenology and walking and place and any way to kind of snap yourself out of this. But what it is you're trying to snap yourself out from is, to me, a form of landscape consumption that is habituated and that is probably, to me, in my interests, it's a result of very particular histories and the physical environment becoming something very particular to us. I forgot what I was going to say now. There's something somewhat absurd that if you go to I keep thinking of Venice both because of Counterstrike and because of, in my head, what would be a tourist city, and I think of Venice. We all temporarily become experts in, I don't know what's there, like some Renaissance architecture or the 5 big names of Renaissance painting or something like this. That it's somewhat absurd, but it answers a question of what to do when you're here, and places like Venice give us an extreme example. But I think that way of engaging is in a diffused way, because of I think it's kind of a modern thing. It's one of the major default ways of engaging. And what I kind of like about Garry's mod is that even the objects themselves seem to be the artifacts of, like, the game designer had to decide what are the objects we need in, do I start with some photographs? I'll have to model some trees, I'll have to model some rocks. These are the things that need to be here. And that process of kind of hunting for images and objects, to me, is still present in all of these spaces. We had to populate the space somehow. So we had to go out hunting for objects to recreate this, I don't know, in this way, postcard landscape or something.
I mean, it's a categorization, right? It's the construction of a database, essentially, of objects and entities, as a kind of vocabulary of place, I suppose, right? Like, what are the components for the kind of places you should be able to create in this game? And of course, there are things like, there's a certain category of places which it privileges based on its derivation from Half-Life 2. We have these kind of wintry, leafless trees and these ruined carts. We don't have palm trees and sandy beaches and luxury yachts.
Well, there's actually
something like that.
Don't forget the lovely sandy beach of the Lost Highway in Half-Life 2. But yes, I take your point. We had this conversation actually with Nick the other night, that there's a peculiar resonance with Nick's study of oh god, this is what happens when I'm trying to think of things on the spot.
Talking about Stalker, yeah.
Yes. So what's the site he's talking about? The name of the nuclear disaster place?
So the town of Pripyat, right, near Chernobyl.
Yes. Yeah, and sort of the Eastern European chic of Half-Life 2 is also sort of there in the background. There's another map that I've been using the same game map for us for the whole seminar, but there's a map called GM construct, and it's just all these kind of vaguely 1970s Eastern European apartment blocks that really sort of City 17 with a big grassy space in the middle. I'm just going to have a look at the YouTube chat because there's my inability to cognitively multitask means that I've ignored a bunch of questions. I think Stefano Tipsitude has there's a conversation between Matse, Tipsitude, and Usum about. Let me
have a look at the YouTube comments.
Yeah, so I think Emma is pointing out that there's a slippage in. I guess like I pointed out that Emma's definition of games as ruins, and here I am kind of using another overarching category of playgrounds, and I think I mentioned this before. There's with a good generalization, we lose specificity. Now, what else have we got here? Bjarke says, no worries. I hope... Okay, that's about the sound stopping and starting. Okay. Marce loved your joke, the contemporary crisis of temporality. Okay. Emma says, do we Garry's mod into a place each time through practice placemaking? Do we make Garry's mod into a place each time through practice and placemaking? I think that's sort of what we've been discussing a little bit already.
I mean, that's kind of what I like to at with the idea of this kind of like, the place bubbles which can emerge, right? In the sense of like these, then the chaos might have something which is stable enough to be called a place, right? That you construct, right? In the same way that we had for most of the seminars, the stage with the chair, and that implies a particular arrangement of like someone sitting on the chair and speaking, and presumably an audience standing in front of them, even though that hardly ever happened. I guess yes, but even so not even every time we play, but like it's constantly shifting into new places, right? Things are added, things are removed, and then that would make me question whether or not any of them are stable enough to actually accrue some kind of placeness.
I mean, I tried to answer this question a little bit when I was writing my dissertation, and I was playing Garry's mod quite a lot and really going from, like, Garry's mod kind of peaked in popularity, I think around 2015. I think it was one of the top selling games on Steam at the time. But, the player numbers are still reasonably high, and when I'm in Europe, there seems to be a greater chance of me being on an English-speaking server that's got a fast enough connection. And I was on these servers quite a lot, trying to, I guess, find this particular type of experience of place. And there was one really nice evening I had where, I just started playing with some random people, and without really any voice chat, people just, started teaching me to do things, or they'd build a car and we'd ride around in it. And that experience of, I think I compared it to being a new kid at school, where you have no idea what's going on. All you see is people doing stuff that you can't understand, and then somebody lets you into the game and tells you what they're doing, which otherwise looked completely incomprehensible, and you become a part of the game. And that, from various kind of definitions of place, seemed to me a pretty good shift from this social moment that gives a hierarchical meaning, because it's the only mediating device between these people that you otherwise have no connection with. With that, do you think that will sort of satisfy the temporary definition of place?
I suppose so, in the sense, even now for the hour or hour and a half, even on that server, certain kind of practices do emerge, right? And certain relations do emerge. You do kind of set in certain patterns of what you're doing, even if it feels like they don't have much consequence, and like going further, it might have been a bit boring. But you do start setting in the trying to relate to the other people, whether that's through shooting them or to spawn things on their heads. or whatever it might be. And of course, this case is a special case because I suppose for the people on the server already, and so there are kind of, let's say, pre-existing relations which factor into how you're behaving towards them or not. But yeah, of course, the playground, a social place. You very rarely, you can't play on your own in a playground. You can just swing.
Yeah.
For your own kinesthetic pleasure, but it's generally a shared place, and the kind of practices we engage in a playground do tend to be to a significant degree social and performative on that level.
Yeah.
So absolutely.
Yeah, it's all. I think there's a. I mean, the other thing with Garry's mod is that we're using it. The thing that aesthetically fascinated me the most with Garry's mod is the retreat away from structured play and the boredom that you encounter. That I find it very hard to get bored in a single player first-person shooter or even in a multiplayer like Counterstrike because it's so clear what you have to do, and it's kind of it prompts you. Whereas here, within a couple of minutes, you get confronted with yourself and your own lack of ideas of what to do. And the vast majority of Garry's mod servers, as far as I can see, are roleplay servers that have, invented within themselves, both from the admins and usually probably through custom scripts that physically change what you can and can't do on the space. Reintroduce that resistance, because without it, it's there's to me a sort of almost sublime moment where you see. I don't know, maybe like going to Disneyland after hours when nobody's performing anymore, or being on a movie set after the camera stops rolling. I can't think of the best analogy, but this is the moment in Garry's mod where I typically want to play with, which is the point where it's all of the prompts for placemaking, where we all have a common game to play, and therefore social relations, kind of like teamwork in Counter-Strike, you have to work on very, very quickly. Otherwise, nobody wants you on their side. All of these things are removed, and it's this kind of scrambling for maybe a sense of place to replace the boredom or that sort of lost in space moment of there's a crack in the visor and all of the oxygen is sucked out of the room. This to me is a sort of the somewhat profound moment of Garry's mod where the most obvious thing in the game is missing, but because it's a computer game, the peculiarity of all of these objects is still here, so the thing that's missing is so specific.
Yeah. I think that is an interesting moment, right? So, you're talking about this kind of sublime moment of, like, almost, this abyss of purposelessness, right? Which is a kind of very almost existential feeling. And, as soon as you feel that, you're probably going to be driven to find something to bridge that abyss with, right? Find something to do. Okay, I'm here. There's no goal. There is no task which is being suggested. Well, one of the options would be to just quit the game and go do something else. But then if you've made the decision to stick around in this game, maybe because you have to deliver a seminar in the game, then you start to think about, okay, well, what do I do now, right? You're kind of driven into this necessity of self-determination in a sense. And it's just a determination of kind of your being and of the place around you at the same time, right? Those two are kind of two sides of the same coin.
So I had kind of a cheat by making people give a presentation. I cheated my way into forcing everybody into this moment.
Yeah. Of course, that gives a particular task, right? But if hypothetically you had to spend, 10 hours in Garry's mod on your own or with some random people, and there's no structured activity like a seminar, provide some kind of extrinsic significance to it,
Mm.
you would probably end up trying to, at least I don't want to make any claims, but what I would do is probably try to find some kind of stability by either through the imposition of a project or not. And this goes back also to what I was saying about Animal Crossing New Horizons. I think most of us, at least my experience, you kind of make some use of the landscaping tools. You create, a nice landscape which you're happy with, but you don't want to keep changing it all the time. You try to arrive at something where you then arbitrarily decide, okay, this is it. This is my island for now. This is the place I'm going to habituate myself to. So there's a kind of experiential drive towards stability, even within the kind of infinite recombination and making and unmaking that these sandbox games give you. Right? To kind of make those place bubbles a little bit more permanent, but more and temporary, somewhere in between. It's kind of pull between
It reminds me of
longevity.
Dumb stuff like I don't know if I think I'm a creature of habit, but if I go to if I travel and go somewhere different, often the first place I find to have breakfast at or a coffee at, I go back there the next day. Like it's to find some sense of like, I guess it's being a real creature of habit to give these little temporary structures, because the absence of the meta structure of your everyday is gone. I've sort of shocked that I do it, but it's somebody mentioned in the YouTube chat Instagram hiking, which I think speaks well to this tourism thing we were speaking about before. But even a hike itself, the difference between a hike and a walk is that a hike usually has a preset challenge. I'm going to walk from here to here along this trail, and so therefore I'll dress differently. I'll make sure I take a sandwich and a bottle of water and insect spray or wherever it is. It's inserting a purpose into something that if you try to explain, I don't know, to an alien the difference, I'm sure they'd think you were slightly insane, but it's I feel we're bordering on this conversation of existential boredom or something, and the things that I know some of you have been working on with I'm thinking of Ollie and Sebastian driving around in Euro Truck Simulator. At what point do you get over the game in order to either make games for yourself or to, I don't know, try to make yourself as bored as possible as some point of self-realization?
The question of boredom is not something which I've often or specifically looked at, let's say, but it seems to be related to this question of infinite possibility. It's actually something which both Han and Campagna talk about in different degrees. So they talk about the response or the result of this kind of infinity of possibilities, infinity of possible recombinations, as being about boredom.
I think, Daniel, it sounds like we're starting to have some audio issues, actually. The audio on my side is popping in and out a little bit.
Sorry to hear that. I'm hearing you fine still.
Yeah, I think it might be something to do with Discord. So I missed the last little bit of what you were saying. Would you mind just repeating it a little once again, and then I think we might move to wrapping up the session.
Sure. No, I was just saying that, I was referring to Byung-Chul Han and Federico Campagna, my presentation, and both of them do talk about tangentially, so it's something they didn't necessarily focus on. They both talk about boredom and depression as kind of different tendencies which result from this structureless infinitude of possibilities. where one action is as good as any other, where all actions are possible, and where there is no resistance and no waiting, then boredom ensues. And it's interesting to think of also, examples I can think of in fiction. I mentioned the chapter in Julian Barnes' History of the World in 10.5 chapters. This vision of the perfect afterlife. You have eternity and everything you could possibly ever want available to you, with no effort, unless you want to kind of simulate effort. Then it becomes boring, right? Eventually, then there is no, with no resistance, then comes no drive, perhaps, right? No structure.
Yeah, Ollie once said to me that what I was describing in Garry's mod was sort of the ultimate God mode of a game. That and how much of a strange kind of game you end up with, that it's like becoming bored with yourself. I think is sort of what I find is the ultimate risk in Garry's mod isn't being defeated by the level. It's kind of just giving into your own boredom or something like that.
Does Garry's mod give us the sublime boredom of God? Give us access to that?
Maybe that's another question for another seminar.
Perhaps.
I might wrap things up. Daniel, thanks so much for a wonderful presentation and for sticking around so long for the discussion, and for generously giving us your time and indulging the project.
Thank you for the invitation. I enjoyed this.
Oh, great. So for everybody watching on YouTube, I'm going to finish off the stream here, and we have one more presentation which is in 3 days' time. I think there's a little bit of confusion with me still on my Greenwich Mean Times and my +1s and stuff, so just check the Facebook, and I believe that everything is correct on YouTube, but I'm hunting around for little errors in notifications and dates, but it's in 3 days' time, I believe at the same time. So thanks everyone who tuned in. Thank you Bjarke, thank you Daniel, and I'll hope to see everyone for the final seminar in 3 days. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye bye.